Hi, this is Paul. I was traveling Thursday and Friday morning, so I had some time on a plane, so I got a chance to listen to some more of Carefree Wandering's videos. And whereas I disagree with him about a lot of things, I thought his presentations were clear. I thought they were interesting. I thought they spoke to a lot of assumptions that people had. It's those kinds of videos that I tend to be interested in and choose to engage with and do some critique of. When he talks about critique, he's got a very definite idea about what critique is based on Kant, and that's in some of his previous videos. This video, Why Sam Harris is Wrong, a critique of Sam Harris's moral landscape, I thought that was a very interesting video, and if I found that to be a very helpful video in terms of understanding a good many of his other videos, because obviously Sam Harris in the moral landscape tries to use well-being as a scientific term that we can somehow scale up and talk about some degree of absolute morality. And in this video, he references Wittgenstein about, sort of there's absolute morality, which we can't have access to because it would destroy all other sorts of relative moralities. And so we're stuck. Basically, morality is sort of a language game that we play. Now, I'm interested in why he says that, because I think if we're talking from below, morality is much more of a status game that we play. We keep moral tabs on each other. This is sort of following Jonathan Haidt's work in the happiness hypothesis, that morality is something that we sort of keep tabs with on each other because we want to know if we can trust each other. I've been watching a lot of Survivor lately too, so that game is all about morality and trustworthiness and reputation and so on and so forth. So I might come back around and do a commentary on this video. A number of you asked that I comment on the Wokism video, but again, I think his videos very much build on each other. And when you listen to more of them, you can have a better sense of exactly how he's using language and what he means in these other videos. So again, this Wokism video, there's two Sam Harris critique videos. One is shorter. It's basically like the first 18 minutes of this video, and this one's longer. The longer one's better. He goes into quite a few more topics, goes into more about religion. And so again, it was quite a good video. But let's take a look at the Wokism video, and I'm probably going to make reference to a lot of what I heard in the Sam Harris video as I critique this Wokism video.
In response to our last video on Kant's ethics, we actually got only relatively few responses actually on Kant, and more about Derek Chauvin and the case of his trial, which I spoke about at the end of the video.
Now, that shouldn't come as any surprise that he got more response on Derek Chauvin, because why? Because that's a real case. People are really invested in it, and Kant's ethics tend to be abstract. Now, in many of his videos, he's going to basically make an appeal for this vision of philosophy that can, in some ways, he doesn't say it this way, but you hear the aspiration behind it, sort of save humanity. And on his video about Jordan Peterson, that was another very interesting video. I've really been enjoying listening to his videos, and he doesn't have that many of them, and they're not terribly long, so they're unlike my videos, so they're fairly easy to catch up on.
And even more about Wokism. I quote two of these comments. One is by Luis Soto. I feel as though there is yet to be a proper analysis of Wokism. And another is by Rob Wickline, who says, I'd love to hear a more extended analysis of what you think about the problematic nature of Wokism.
Now, because he's done so many videos on morality, and because of what he's done with the Sam Harris critique of morality, he continues to claim he's not a moral relativist, and I believe that because he doesn't act like a moral relativist. He acts like, in fact, morality is important, and we ought to pay very careful attention to it, and we should be free to go on YouTube and declare what is good, what is bad, what is problematic, what is safe. And he does that all through his videos. The difficulty that you have is then the question, how do I know what is problematic and what is not? This is the question of morality.
you say. And today we're doing just that. The comments on Wokism, even though it was a video on Kant, show how relevant the topic is today. I think Wokism today has Western society in its grip. We're seeing it basically everywhere, in media, in daily life. It defines what people love and hate. For instance, in North America, the basic political schism and social schism that we have right now, the divide between those who are with Trump and those who are against Trump, between the conservatives and the progressives, is kind of similar to the lines of those in favor and those against Wokism. To mention just one example of how it affects our everyday life from my own experience, in academia, particularly in North America, if you apply for a job nowadays, you're asked to hand in a diversity statement, right? This statement is actually not supposed to kind of critically assess diversity or maybe even question the necessity of such a statement. That wouldn't get you the job. The function of the diversity statement is basically that it's a kind of an exercise in woke language. And despite the...
what it is as a minister who has worked most of his life in religious institutions, it's basically a profession of religious belief. That is what these diversity and inclusion statements are. They're a profession of value, of religious value beliefs. It's her religious test, basically.
Huge impact on everyday life. I think the notion is still largely misunderstood, and particularly by very famous thinkers, just like Jordan Peterson, who's attached the Marxist postmodernist label to Wokism. And that's something that I'd like to criticize in this video and to suggest an alternative understanding of what Wokism is. So,
and again, it's helpful to, when he says criticize, most of us will just sort of take that word in as we commonly understand what we mean to criticize. But again, if you watch some of his previous videos, when he talks about Kant, you have an understanding of, he uses that word in a slightly more technical way in what he's trying to do.
So it is, I think, and others have said this as well, it functions basically as a new form of religion, and more specifically as a new kind of civil religion, which from North America and Western Europe is spreading throughout the globe. Let's start with a preliminary definition of Wokism, and we can just look at...
Now, see, I've watched so many of his videos recently, I don't remember. He goes into Robert Bellah a little bit. Robert Bellah, of course, wrote a very famous essay. You can Google it. If you Google Robert Bellah Civil Religion, you can pull it up. I've read it in some of my previous videos. It has to do, he was looking at the Kennedy administration, and it has to do with the fact that something is functioning. If you go back to the Plow interview with, what was that woman's name? She's a writer, Brunig, for The Atlantic, when she didn't like wokeism being compared to a religion. But one of the ways in which, sort of in a sociological sense, this functions as a religion for the people. It establishes a value hierarchy. It motivates them. It provides an eschatology. Many of the facets of religion it provides. And in many of my videos, I've noted, if you go into the Lincoln Memorial, right behind Lincoln, in this temple, all of these are functioning in the way that other things that we identify as specifically religion, such as a formal religion like Christianity or Judaism or Islam or Buddhism, these things function in this way. Now, they're not necessarily completely incompatible. For example, in the United States, there are many people for whom their sort of religious connection to the nation, the government of the United States, the nation, the tradition, the story, fits very easily with their Christianity. That's not difficult to understand given the deep connection between Protestantism and the founding of the United States.
What Wikipedia says about it. Wikipedia basically defines Wokism as a public discourse, and I quote now, concerning racial inequalities and other social disparities, such as discrimination against the LGBTQ community, women, immigrants, and other marginalized populations. What this definition as correct as it is, though, misses is, I think, a central aspect of Wokism, namely that it is based on identity politics. So identity politics is basically an approach to politics as struggle for the empowerment of personal identity. And it's typically based on exactly those aspects that were mentioned by Wikipedia, such as race, gender, sexual orientation, and religion as well. Now, identity politics is therefore, so to speak, the predecessor of Wokism. And identity politics has been around since the 1970s. And there has been a relatively strong critique of identity politics in the past decade. I'd just like to point to one example of this, a book by the center-leftist liberal intellectual Mark Lilia, who in 2017 published The Once and Future Liberal After Identity Politics. So in 2017, Lilia said basically identity politics is over. But I think it's very obvious that identity politics is far from over. It evolved into something new, into something even more intense and more widespread. So
Now, a little bit later, he's going to critique Peterson. And I really appreciated his critique of noticing where identifying Wokism as neo-Marxism really falls short. It's helpful, though, even though he doesn't mention it in this section, that the kinds of critiques that you get from Peterson and James Lindsay and a number of the others who he will then basically disagree with a little bit later, he is in alignment with these others in this part of the critique, that Wokism is a form of identity politics. And, of course, we've talked about that quite a bit in the past. For Peterson, when he does his video on Peterson and he critiques Peterson directly, he critiques a lot of Peterson's individualism. Now, the form of identity politics that is done here is basically a sort of identity class. So you have marginalized groups, you have people of color, you have sexual minorities, you have people who are sort of clustered in this, and people either deserve treatment or remediation or special consideration as based on their group. Now, of course, Peterson, because he's a strong individualist, will not like that, because you're not treating people as individuals. It's a strong theme in Peterson's work. But the identity aspect, Peterson, Lindsay, and HGM here could very easily agree on.
I would say Wokism is the comeback of identity politics with a vengeance. So to give another first definition of Wokism, we can say that Wokism is a renewed and intensified form of identity politics that is now present in all sectors of society, at least in the West: politics, media, advertising, sports, art, education, and even military.
So again, this definition, I don't think James Lindsay or Jordan Peterson or many others who he will later critique will disagree with. So this is very much a piece of Wokism that everyone will agree with, that it's fundamentally about treatment of people understood with respect to a particular identity aspect of themselves.
Rather than just giving a theoretical description of what Wokism is, we can look at an example. And there was recently, the CIA posted a very interesting recruiting video that was full of Wokism, and actually the video got a lot of critical reactions to it. I hope you will look at it. It features a woman who calls herself intersectional cisgender millennial. She's obviously feminist. She's wearing a feminist t-shirt. She's non-white. She talks a lot about her immigrant background. She talks about her anxiety disorder. She's not slim. And then she finishes up all this by saying that she's unapologetically me. And I think that's an interesting phrase. So basically, it's a claim for personal identity recognition.
Now, here again, when you look at Peterson's individualism, this is rather interesting because unapologetically me. I am an individual, but I'm also a part of these classes. I'm a part of my identity has all of these aspects. I didn't hear about the CIA the recruitment video, but it is fascinating.
And she is an exemplary person combining all these woke identity markers, and that's obviously meant to show that the CIA embraces diversity. Now, as mentioned, there are lots of critical reactions to this CIA video, and viewers point out several paradoxes. The first one I'd like to quote is by Patrick Perry, who says, "She says she's not a box-checking exercise while checking all of the boxes of her identity." And this really shows one paradox in wokeness, namely that these personal identity markers are not merely personal. They are somehow supplied already in the discourse, and they only pertain to several identity features, as I mentioned, race.
So here again, you have this interesting connection with individualism versus class or group,
gender, and so forth. So, for instance, my red hair probably would not count for a claim to be unapologetically me. A second point is mentioned by Mr. Talldude24, who writes in his comment on the CIA recruiting video, "So now they'll be torturing people while wearing shirts that portray female empowerment and Black Lives Matter. So it's good now." So this points to the fact that wokeism does some sort of moral whitewashing. It moralizes that which is amoral or sometimes even immoral, right? So here we see in the CIA ad a commercially produced kind of moral profiling of the institution or organization, which, for instance, is known for torturing people. The first question I want to address about wokeism is the question, is wokism leftist? And as mentioned, prominent critics of wokism, just as Jordan Peterson or Donald Trump for that matter, come from a conservative or alt-right position, and they're staunchly at least anti-leftist. So
now, part of what's interesting about the choice, now of course Donald Trump and Jordan Peterson will get you clicks, but if you're really looking for conservatives, not really Trump or Peterson. I mean, Trump is sort of all over the map in many respects, and Peterson really, as IDW, sort of comes from, at least on the U.S. spectrum, a little left of center. Now, Peterson has become sort of a darling of conservatives, but I mean, there are plenty of conservative people you could have named there. Now, I think his treatment here of left versus right is really very, very helpful too.
That wokism is leftist is a claim that has been successfully made by the right, and I want to challenge that claim. It led to the unfortunate effect that people feel uncomfortable with criticizing wokism. They don't even like the word because they think it's too negative and they think it's used by rightist people. And that was also evident in one of the comments on our video by Minch333, who said, "I do hope this channel doesn't fall down the reactionary grifter rabbit hole."
Now, that's a very interesting comment because on one hand, obviously reactionary is sort of a mindless, reactive, usually from the right. But the grifter word in there means what? It's for commercial advantage? Well, as he's going to point out, wokism and commercial advantage have been in bed for a very long time.
When I was hinting at a critique of wokism. So if you say something critical about wokism, that already kind of puts you at least potentially into a sort of rightist corner. And again, that's something I want to strongly dispute today. Nevertheless, technically, I think we can probably say that wokism is somehow left. Because as I said at the beginning, if you look at the political division left and right as it exists nowadays in North America and in Europe, then obviously the people on the left are kind of closer to Wokism, and the people on the right are more against Wokism. So it does correspond to the distinction between left and right in the actual political arena nowadays, at least in the West. However, and this is the important point I want to make, the meaning of what is left has fundamentally changed with Wokism. So Wokism is somehow a left that is no longer left, a sort of a post-left. To summarize this very, very briefly.
And I think, again, sort of picking on Trump, who, let's not forget, was a political contributor to the Bill Clinton for president campaign, Jordan Peterson and his own political history. There's been a lot of definitions changing here. And so, I really appreciated this segment of the video where he does a little history of right and left and what these things have meant in the past. And again, if you go back to some of my thoughts about consciousness, why consciousness, this monofocal consciousness, always sort of splits into dualities. And so what tends to happen is the elements of these contrasting dualities will often sort of change under the surface and while we're not paying attention, but we'll continue to use the labels. And I think that's a big piece of, I think, a lot of the valid points that he makes in this video about some aspects of Wokism that are not necessarily in alignment with some traditional leftist perspectives, at least in terms of what left has meant in past generations.
Traditionally, when the terminology left and right was used to make a basic political distinction, namely in the French Revolution, the term left, or the notion of left, indicated those who were more strongly Republican, whereas the notion of right indicated those who were...
Okay, now remember, it's Republican. That doesn't mean the Republican Party in the United States. It means Republican in terms of people who believed in a republic as opposed to a monarchy, which he's about to say.
More friendly towards monarchy or aristocracy. So it had to do with a basic political or constitutional division. Now, that changed throughout the 19th and 20th century when, with the rise of Marxism, it became more a socio-economic designation. So simply put, the left was closer to Marxism and communism.
So again, first the view was, let's say, the form of government, monarchy versus a republic, and now it's going to be used more in terms of an economic struggle.
It was more critical of capitalism, and it took on working class causes, whereas the right was in favor of capitalism, liberal market, and often staunchly anti-communist. So the notion of leftism changed from a politically Republican-focused idea towards a more class-oriented socioeconomic idea. And now we see...
Now, it's helpful, again, here to remember that we've used, a lot of these terms, they sort of jump around. Class we can use sort of as a group of people as such as a racial group. But with Marxism, they're going to be used as a group of people with respect to, let's say, the means of production and who is controlling the means of production. And, it's very difficult to understand. The Rest is History just did an excellent episode on the Industrial Revolution where the author that they brought in talked about some of these issues. Race is not a class in Marxism, but now in some ways, Peterson, and he's had some videos about that, tries to say, well, this has sort of been a further evolution of Marxism in terms of the dynamics. And in some ways, you almost get the sense that we're talking about Marxism in an abstract way, sort of like you're talking about a religion, more in terms of a process or a set of relationships rather than specifically what Marxism was about.
A third shift where leftism with identity politics and
now we should also make the point that people on the street who might themselves, who consider themselves at least left in America now and woke in America now, may take up hammer and sickle as symbols for their struggle and appropriate a lot of that language. And I mean, he's basically going to argue that there's sort of an essential way in which wokeism deviates from Marxism. And I think he makes a very important point. At the same time, if people who are identifying with these labels also embrace and fly a flag with a hammer and sickle and sort of defend aspects of, let's say, aspects that we would look at economically as, central planning, greater government intervention in the economy, things like this. Well, they kind of sound like communism, but to kind of turn it around, they don't act like communists because they want to make a lot of money too, and they don't, turn their back on Apple products because of its economic and commercial success. So there's just a ton of things in here, which I think makes this video a very helpful contribution to a lot of the other critiques that many of us have seen in the Jordan Peterson, James Lindsay area.
With wokeism is no longer primarily political, nor even primarily economic. Instead, as the term identity politics says, it has become identity-oriented, right? It's about, to use again the word of the woman in the CIA commercial, it's about being unapologetically me. So it's about such things as language use, personal pronouns, about personal sexuality, and other things associated with the capacity to be unapologetically oneself. Now, why is wokeism, that is no longer primarily about constitutional issues and neither about socioeconomic issues, but about personal identity, why is this not leftist in a traditional sense? Well, first of all, as Lilia has said, it is hyper-individualist rather than communitarian.
Now again, is it individualist? Unapologetically me. Yeah, sort of, but it's still identity groups as such and vying for treatment as victims, and therefore, through victimization, a degree of privilege.
And similar things, similar criticisms have been made by other liberal, central leftist thinkers, like, for instance, Kwame Appiah in his book 2018, The Lies That Bind, Rethinking Identity, Creed, Country, Color, Class, Culture. So they all point out that there is a strong individualistic element rather than a communitarian element to it. So that is, of course, not really traditionally left. Then,
and, when we talked about the Anabaptist tradition with respect to the Plow podcasts and the Brunig conversation with, that wasn't on the Plow podcast, that was on Monk's podcast. Part of what has been interesting to me, whereas I saw in the 70s groups of people who would, let's say, sacrifice their own access to economic flourishing, both Christians who did this became intentionally poor in some ways or dependent in order to serve others as part of their Christian devotion. People who would refuse economic progress and personal affluence for the name of the working class or the struggle. That's sort of classical Marxism, classical Marxist language. This current crop of woke love to make a lot of noise and want to tax the rich, but they don't expect that this will cost them much of anything to be involved of the struggle. Someone else must pay for the poor classes of the world, of these racial and gender classes to, reparations are lovely as long as some theoretically group of tyrants, oppressed people, wealthy people pay, and not me. And so when Jordan Peterson had his conversation with the woman from GQ, he sort of put it right back on her. Well, why don't you give up your job? Well, I like my job. Well, give up your job so that a person of color can have your job. You're crowding. So.
And secondly, and this is a critique from the left that I more strongly agree with, is that it sidelines class issues and it sidelines a struggle against capitalism. And this criticism against identity politics has been made by the most famous leftist public intellectuals like Noam Chomsky or Slavoj Žižek. And it has also been made by some people that I've been referring to in previous videos, Walter Ben Michaels, for instance, and Adolf Reed Jr., who has called identity politics and implicitly thereby also Wokism as the left wing of neoliberalism. And I think this fact that Wokism is more neoliberal than traditionally leftist is also reflected in a phenomenon that I also mentioned in previous videos, namely the sidelining of actually leftist politicians like Jeremy Corbyn or Bernie Sanders by their own parties. And they've been replaced by more woke candidates who are at the same time less left. So,
and I think this is, I think, a very good point. Now, part of what we struggle with when we talk about these groups are that in some ways, so many who sort of identify as woke, it's not only a civil religion, it's sort of a folk religion. And in many people, it's so completely incoherent that, well, I'm against capitalism and they're dripping with Apple products. Well, how against capitalism can you be if you're celebrating and drowning in the products of one of the most successful capitalist corporations in the world, who also is using woke language in order to signal that we're part of the good guys, even though they're one of the most successful capitalist groups around, who has, made a practice of, legally avoiding as much taxation as possible. You look at this stuff and it just makes a lot of woke individuals just unserious.
Identity politics and Wokism is about personal identity affirmation. It's about being unapologetically me.
And I think that's right. Personal identity affirmation.
So in this way, it is left in a new sense, less left than the left used to be, or post-left. It is more about creating identity profiles than about struggling for a different kind of state or economy.
It's more about being seen as struggling for a different kind of state or economy than actually imagining that this different kind of state or economy will ever come to be. And this is where, I've been working towards his pro-felicity arguments and his identity arguments, because when we get to the point of where exactly is the self for this group of people, and when they talk about authenticity, what's very interesting is it's not actually authentic to a particular referent, but it's authentic to a hyper thing, or a we'll get there in some other videos. You're not, if you look for, let's say, a counterfeit $50 bill, it's counterfeit because it fails in terms of its reference to the genuine article. But there is no genuine article that actually can be pointed to. It's much more sort of a collective impression that one is trying to participate in.
Now, a second, more specific question directly related to this is Wokism cultural Marxism? Which again is something that Jordan Peterson has said multiple times. And it's also been adopted by people like Trump and others. So they succeeded.
Now why would using those words cultural Marxism be helpful if you are participating in a political debate? Well, it's fairly easy, because you are trying to leverage the the specter of communism that haunted the 20th century and declare that this path will basically bring it back. And if there are enough shallow wokists or people who are using this language in order to climb up a political or an economic hierarchy, well, I suppose that the threat might be considered real, but you would be hard-pressed to find people who actually can pull this off. And I think part of where we've seen this is in Benjamin Boyce's documenting of the meltdown of Evergreen. They couldn't run a community college, never mind a nation, and we've seen this again and again and again and again. It's simply incoherent, whereas, Stalin could run things, well, on the corpses and blood of many other people, but he could run things. And there's so much of this stuff is just so simply incoherent.
And as I said, in wrongly labeling Wokism as hard left or cultural Marxism. But if it is cultural, simply put, then it is not Marxism. Cultural Marxism is an oxymoron. Marxism is not about culture struggle, it's about class struggle. Marxism has never been about the cultural superstructure, but always about the socio-economic base structure, the means of production, which then support or build the foundation for a culture.
Now, I think there's some validity to this point. I'm not sure how strong it is, but I think the point itself, which is that Marx's vision of Marx sort of trades on Hegel, and Hegel imagines this inevitable evolution of Geist or spirit that's going to continue to move. And Marx imagines that instead of Geist, this abstract thing, what you have is this economic engine, which is going to continue to evolve in a certain direction, and of course simply doesn't. And this is part of why Stalin believes he has to starve the Ukraine in order to prime the pump to get it to work. And the idea was bad, and it just simply never worked. And so then you wound up with this strange central planning system that the Soviet Union tried to practice, but it could simply not compete with the much more chaotic, but the markets of the West that sort of assumed these markets are too complex to manage. So you sort of let them go and you try and tinker from the edges with one way or another in terms of the government. But the market in that sense is much more of an emergent, even living thing instead of this simplistic process that is supposed to pass through predicted evolutionary stages to arrive at this utopia. I mean, it's fascinating that the kinds of things, what I'm about to say might be misunderstood, that Marx has never been tried. Well, no, Marx was begun to be tried, and it just simply didn't work at the start. And so they kept trying to do other things, and those things didn't work either. But yet, how Marx continues to sort of get tagged along with these things when he simply doesn't have anything to do with a lot of these things. Now, the community that sort of gathered around his name has evolved into other things. And again, in some of those senses, I think you can say Wokism is related to Marxism in the sense that a certain group of people have identified with both and assumed that one has much to do with the other, even though I think he's making a strong argument that they really don't have a lot to do with each other. But if a lot of wokists are calling themselves Marxist, it's how are you really going to criticize people for saying they're Marxist when some of them are basically saying, yeah, that's what we are, even if they don't have much of an understanding of what Marx actually said? Well, we're the heirs of the Marxist tradition. Oh, okay.
So a cultural Marxism is a contradiction in terms. And we can see that Wokism is by no means Marxist in how it has been deeply embedded and made supportive of capitalism, right? There are now basically almost every brand has become a woke brand. It's a major marketing tool. And marketing...
Now, when he's looking at some of these examples,
a woke brand.
I'm making myself fit. One of the pieces that I think he should probably bring Robert Bellah in on again is the question of expressive individualism or Sheilaism. And this hasn't gotten enough attention in the conversation, I don't think. So this is my copy of Robert Bellah's Habits of the Heart. And I read it, I believe I read it in seminary. And Robert Bellah, Richard Marsden, William Sivelson, Ann Swindler, and Stephen Tipton. So this book around, this is my old yellow copy, underlined back from seminary days. Wokism didn't come from nothing, and it really didn't come from communism. And I think in this video critique, what we're seeing in things here is much more expressive individualism that has sort of combined with, let's say, a sensitivity created from the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the LGBT movement. And there's a good number of people who have sort of realized that they're on the wrong side of history with respect to many of these the oppression Olympics, and so therefore can ally. And I think about, Justin Trudeau or Gavin Newsom, who are two of the most whitest, most privileged people you could possibly imagine. But by taking on this moral language game, they, in a sense, can become redeemed. And I think actually the end of this video, he makes some very interesting points that we're going to see. So an advertising campaign like that, that's pretty much good old-fashioned expressive individualism, of which Robert Bellah wrote quite convincingly about all the way back in the 1980s.
It's a major marketing tool. And marketing and advertising is at the heart of capitalism.
Again, all of these ads he's showing, this is much more expressive individualism than wokism, because it doesn't have sort of the victim identitarian social constructivist struggle in order to achieve some utopia that somehow incoherently both abolishes capitalism while riding on its back. I mean, again, it's simply incoherent the way a lot of the stuff is played out.
Right? And it's even used for the military-industrial complex, a CIA video. So I think it's pretty obvious that it is not the case that the left has, with wokism, subverted the CIA and turned it into a leftist organization.
Now, this is where we sort of get back into his conversation about morality and Sam Harris and Wittgenstein and sort of a moral discourse. Now, that language is pretty abstract. What I think a lot of this has to do with is, so morality, again, is the upper register. Morality very quickly gets spoken of in the upper register, up there with heaven, mind, spirit, eternity, timelessness in many ways. And whenever we sort of say it's wrong, it's bad, it's problematic, we flip up into this timeless register, into this upper register, and it's static up there, okay? You really can't reach for that kind of speech without it. Now, again, from below, why do we have moralities? Well, I think we have moralities surely to help guide ourselves towards better, not worse. But again, in terms of, he's right that a lot of that is quite relative. But we do this also with respect to society and status. Who can I trust? Who do I want to be? Who do I want to be with?
But rather that wokism has presented capitalism and the political and military institutions supporting it, like the CIA, with an opportunity to what we could call culturally appropriate and thereby subvert leftist ideas.
And I think this is a powerful point.
So in this second question then, again referring to Peterson, is Wokism postmodernist? And this claim has not only been made by Jordan Peterson, but also by a book, Cynical Theories, which was recommended by a reader to me. And I think this claim is equally, if not even more, problematic or actually false. So postmodernism, if you allow the pun, is in essence non-essentialist. It's really subverting any idea of something like an essential identity, which is so much central to identity politics and also Wokism.
See, now, I disagree with that point there, because I much more disagree with James Lindsay's point that he made to Benjamin Boyce, that this is where we get into the frame issue, that your religion or your God is the thing that you can't deconstruct. Now, what do you mean can't deconstruct? Because we can deconstruct all sorts of things. No, you can't deconstruct it without losing your identity. It's the frame through which you see the rest of the world. Okay, so if there's a basic ethnic component to this identity, or it's your sense of oppression, that you can't deconstruct. And whereas, let's say, if you look at postmodernity as in some ways wishful thinking that all grand narratives can sort of be swept away, postmodernity has itself failed because it itself is incoherent, because it offers itself as the grand narrative through which all other narratives can be deconstructed, which is basically the definition of any narrative or any frame, and we simply must have a frame in order to see the world.
Postmodernism views identity as socially constructed, as fluid, and not as something that really inherently constitutes someone. Moreover, postmodernism avoids simple binaries that are so present in Wokism. It hardly subscribes to any unconditional values. There is no universal hierarchy of values. There's a strong non-normative tendency in postmodernism, and Wokism is extremely normative. And then thirdly, there is no meta-narrative in postmodernism. There is, in particular, no redemption narrative. There is a multiplicity of incommensurable perspectives, paradoxes, and postmodernism is essentially non-ideological, whereas Wokism is strongly redemptive.
Well, except of its own ideology.
Redemptive and constitutes basically the big meta-narrative of our time. So
the difficulty, of course, is that there is in some ways very little redemption or forgiveness in Wokism either. There's sort of a redemption narrative, but it's a never-ending redemption process. You have to keep getting in touch with your oppression, and you will never actually escape from either being oppressed or being the oppressor. Finally, both sides are locked in forever to that. And the reason we know that is because we keep digging up history and labeling the people that we dig up as this or that eternally, and demanding that these labels be continued to be trotted out in public. Now, again, some of the practices look very much like the Cultural Revolution or some of these things. So even if, you see, that's where you get this performative aspect or this performative similarity between Wokism and certain aspects of communism, even if the content of some of these things have shifted pretty dramatically.
I think really that Wokism and postmodernism are radically different from one another, but it has to be admitted that a certain postmodernist jargon has been mixed into or again appropriated by Wokism. And that's why it's often falsely taken to be postmodernist. So why use the term Wokism? It's a negative term, and it's mostly used by people on the right. And again, one viewer pointed this out. I'm quoting here Frank McManus, who says, I just Googled wokeism. All the top results were from right-wing American sources.
Now, what's interesting about this fragility among the woke with respect to labels is part of the strategy of success is to assert that yours is not a movement, it's just reality. And, I see this move made by all sorts of religions. Christianity in some ways some within Christianity have made that move. Christianity isn't a religion, it's a relationship. In a sense, if you eschew all labels, you can sort of avoid critique or criticism or analysis, because one of the first things you do in terms of the process of analysis is that you try to look for labels or terms which will in some instance capture some essence of it so that it can you can get a grip on it, you can hold it up, and you can examine it. And once you examine it, it's now subject to critique or even deconstruction or criticism. And, well, we don't want to be deconstructed or critiqued or criticized, so we're simply going to deny any label they put on us and say, this is just the truth. Oh, okay.
And yet, even though my critique of wokeism is not from the right, I do like the term for one particular reason. Because wokeism is the only of these terms, unlike identity politics or unlike political correctness, unlike virtue signaling, it has very strong religious connotations, right? It connotes awakening. So, and this shows what I think is really at the heart of wokeism, that it's basically a sort of civil religious movement.
And I think he's exactly right here. That's exactly what it is, in my opinion.
It's a kind of a secular awakening, somehow in the tradition of earlier great awakenings in American culture. And thereby actually the term woke...
Now again, in the tradition of, you would have to say, that could be a fairly long video and saying, how is it like it? How is it different from it? And the aspect, which is, whereas the earlier great awakenings very much had a narrative in which the God of the universe, through his spirit, would come into a person and remake and convert and change the person. Again, I did a few videos on Jonathan Edwards and some of what went on in those Puritan Great Awakenings. You don't have an articulation of, let's say, a divine spirit that is coming through and manifesting in the participants of this movement for transformation. There is a sense of transformation that comes on in terms of some people being awakened to the oppression that has been done against them, sort of like taking the pill from Morpheus and arising to see that you thought you were walking around in 1999, but oh no, you're a battery. Okay. In that sense, there's an awakening. So to the oppressed, it is an awakening, realizing that even if they haven't felt oppressed, now I know I've been oppressed, so I must rise up and embrace the identity of oppressed forever, which gives me a moral platform and a righteous moral stance upon which to end the oppression in terms of pointing out the oppressors. And likely for the oppressor that, as John McWhorter pointed out in this one very elitist conference that he went to, someone in fact had someone who would come to their house for a good deal of money and explain to them just exactly how they have used their white privilege or whatever privilege, in fact, they do have in order to oppress others. And this is an ongoing process of continuing to explore and discover the depths of your depravity in your privilege. And so you again have these two-class systems. Now, it's elevating in order to get in touch with your privilege if you're an oppressor, and it's liberating to get in touch with your oppression if you're oppressed, but both oppressor and oppressed are really locked into their situations forever forever being just really just in this lifetime, because it's a deeply secular movement, and there is finally no redemption or escape from these two groups.
Wokism, against the intentions of the people on the right who use it, implies a critique of religion. And again, that's why I do like the term. Now, my central argument is that today's wokism is the civil religion of the West, and it combines two elements.
And I think that's correct. I think that is a great way to say it.
It's traditional U.S. American civil religion and German guilt pride. I'm going to discuss American civil religion first and then German guilt pride second. There's an excellent essay on what American civil religion is. It's written by Robert Bellah in 1967. It's called Civil Religion.
And again, he wrote this in the 80s, so he was continuing in terms of a civil religion. And when he gets to expressive individualism, it's in some ways articulating what this implicit religion of American culture is. And again, Robert Bellah is a sociologist, and so it's very much seeing religion through sort of a Durkheimian lens.
Religion in America. Bellah takes the term civil religion from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and like Rousseau, conceives of it as a shared spiritual, political, moral vision and ideology that has kind of a national foundational impact. He rightly says that American civil religion is grounded in Christianity, but then also in the largely secular ideas that we find in such crucial foundational texts as the Declaration of Independence of the United States. Bellah, at the beginning of the article, quotes someone else, S.M. Lipset, to make an important point. So I quote this quote here. He says, "At least since the early 19th century, civil religion has been predominantly activistic, moralistic, and social, rather than contemplative, theological, or innerly spiritual." So a civil religion basically represents a shift from strictly theological, let's say, transcendent values to activist, moralistic, and social movement. Now
again, in some ways, this combines with some of Stephen Smith's work, where he is noting that his observation that paganism, in many ways, also tended towards a this worldly emphasis as opposed to a next worldly emphasis. And of course, the rise of secularity, in many ways, part of the American experiment was that the government would get out of next worldly speculations and applications in order to limit us to this worldly speculations and applications, in many ways, sort of a scientific empiricist bent.
what does American civil religion consist in? Well, it has strong elements of individualism, a focus on liberty and private property as well, a sense of equality, pursuit of happiness, individual happiness and also collective happiness, progress, prosperity, a sort of pragmatic optimism.
Now again, he's basically quoting from the Declaration of Independence penned by Thomas Jefferson, but Thomas Jefferson in many ways just taking his stuff right from John Locke.
Obama's famous slogan, "Yes, we can," also embodies it. And it combines it with a sense of national destiny, some sort of missionary zeal that is supposed to
an eschatology,
guide the whole world. Or the idea of the United States as some form of beacon of liberty, whose role it is to liberate everyone, basically. Bellah pointed out that this American civil religion comes in different forms, and he saw one as positive and one as negative. So it can, and it did, equally inform something like the civil rights movements of the 1960s and 70s, as well as it did inform the Vietnam War, which also supposed, to liberate the Vietnamese people. So there are clearly different denominations of American civil religion. One that is more republic, one that is more democratic, one that's more progressive, one that's more conservative, one that's more left, one that's more right. And Bella was strongly sympathizing with the more progressive, more leftist denomination, and was actually strongly arguing against the Vietnam War. And he tried to use civil religion to argue against the Vietnam War.
Now it's interesting because when Bella gets to the 80s, his concern about Sheilaism and expressive individualism is in some ways sort of a turn to a more conservative anxiety. And again, that isn't unusual. As people get older, often as they get older, they tend to either become more conservative or they seem more conservative because the context around them is changing, and if they don't change fast enough to keep up, then they just sort of become conservative when they're older.
And equally today, we can say generally the American civil religion as a whole equally informs the Black Lives Matter movement and the war on terror. However, there are two different denominations within this civil religion, and the one is more strongly behind Black Lives Matter, and the other one, the more conservative one, is more behind the war on terror. I think it's pretty obvious that this activist, individualistic, post-leftist American civil religion, as represented by the civil rights movement and by feminism, is what gave rise to identity politics in the USA in the 1970s, which in turn then later on gave rise to Wokism. So
now again, I think it's important to keep in mind the expressive individualism, which I think fits in here in a way to help explain some of the ambiguities that Mueller is seeing in Wokism versus, let's say, older forms of communism.
American civil religion, and particularly its progressive post-leftist denomination, are one decisive element that later on constituted Wokism. Now let's move to the second element, German guilt pride. Of course, the situation in Germany was very different from the situation in the United States after the Second World War, right? Germany lost the war. It was exposed as having committed genocide, and the country ended up divided. And the two different Germanys after the war reacted very differently to their fascist past.
Now, pay attention in this part of the video to the question of moral status. Because again, even if you go back and listen to his video about Sam Harris, where, well, morality, what is morality and how does it work? Well, questions of morality and the difference between East and West Germany with respect to where they stand on a moral landscape really are determinative about how these two groups then proceed into the 1950s and 60s after the war.
Communist Germany defined itself as anti-fascist. The government said, we had nothing to do with the fascists, we were victims. Our leaders were themselves persecuted by the Nazis.
Now, I think Timothy Snyder's Black Earth is a very helpful book in terms of understanding, comparing and contrasting Soviet utopian visions that involve state action to facilitate and inspire the kinds of Marxist evolutionary developments, social class evolutionary developments that are supposed to come and build a utopia, versus German between Nazi sort of hyper-naturalist ideology that wanted to destroy institutions, because by destroying those institutions, then the natural processes in which superior individuals and groups would emerge victorious to wipe out underperforming, in an evolutionary way, underperforming groups against them. That, and this Snyder documented well in terms of this land between Germany and the Soviet Union that they both kept running over: Poland, Belarus, Ukraine. The Soviets would try to come in and build up party apparatus to sort of organize everything. It's a very interesting contrast. Organize everything in order that this Marxist development would somehow bring the utopia. And then the Germans come through and start destroying all of the institutions, so that, and trying to get rid of the people too, so that now suddenly this natural process would emerge in which basically just like Neanderthals are wiped out because their Homo sapiens are superior to Neanderthals. The same with all the different races are sort of seen in similar ways to, say, how Homo sapiens were in contrast to Neanderthals. That's sort of the racial naturalism that Nazi religious ideology embraced.
We actually liberated Germany from fascism. So we are by no means continuing the fascist regime. We are anti-fascists. Now, in West Germany, this was different. Western Germany somehow acknowledged that it was a successor state of Nazi Germany, but it also, of course, acknowledged that Nazi Germany was basically just an enormous crime. So Western Germany adopted the following strategy. The aim was to basically admit a guilt, but at the same time trying to pay off the debt. And so there was the idea that Germany can somehow work towards a Schlussstrich, a final line, when all the debt has been paid off. Now, after 1989, after the breakdown of the Soviet
Union. Now, before he gets there, that whole idea of being able to finally pay the debt, how Christian is that idea? Because in Christianity, if I look at it, say, it's through the lens of the Heidelberg Catechism, my own tradition, the debt cannot be paid by human beings. Even my individual debt that I rank up, not having gassed any group of people by virtue of racism or any other thing, if my debt can't be paid by any other human being, how will, let's say, a social, cultural, national debt be paid by themselves? How could, in any way, this great horror be redeemed?
Union after German reunification and the end of the Cold War, Germany got reunited, and then obviously those two strategies didn't really work anymore. And then a new strategy was developed. And this strategy, I think, is perfectly represented by what now became basically the symbol of the new Germany in the center of Berlin, the new capital of the reunified Germany, namely the Holocaust Memorial. And the Holocaust Memorial represents this new idea that, yes, we accept our guilt, but it is a guilt that can never be paid off. It will never go away. It's a guilt that we inherited from the previous generation and that we also internalize. So we define ourselves by admitting this immense guilt.
Now, again, there's something very deeply connected with, let's say, Calvinism with something like this. Part of Calvinism is the profession of total depravity, that the debt is such that I cannot make up for it. Now, this move of continuing to bear this guilt. Again, you see, and he's going to make the point, you see this in wokeness, where the oppressor will, until they die, continue to be the oppressor, and even after they die, must be continued to be, well, pointed out as the oppressor, and may not be celebrated even for any good that they might have done, at least not publicly, because they are on the ledger of oppressor. And similarly for the oppressed, that they will always be on that side of the ledger, and their oppression must always be memorialized. And I think he's right that this is sort of a form of trying to manage group debts that all of us at a deep level know cannot be. Now I'm going to use a theological term here, cannot be expiated by any means at our disposal. Okay? What do I mean by expiated? You can go ahead and look it up in Google. It's a theological term. Basically, the sins, what can present Germany do to make up for the sins of its past? Let's say Germany decided to pay every year a certain amount of money to the victims of the Holocaust and the descendants of the victims of the Holocaust. Please tell me what amount of money would cleanse Germany from the debt. Can money do this? Well, let's think about reparations in North America for slaves. What amount of money could possibly expiate America's original sin for slavery? Put a dollar on it. So there's a movie on Netflix, Worth, which sort of gets into this. Well, of course, the airlines and having lax security, allowing hijackers to take the planes. And even though beforehand people would say, yeah, those cockpit doors, planes would be a lot safer if they were reinforced. El Al, Israeli Airlines, had quite a bit stiffer safety measures because of their history of hijacking. So in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, the question was, can we come to a settlement by which the American airline corporations that were hijacked by the terrorists could be expiated of their guilt? How much money? And very quickly you realize no amount of money can do it. And this is the strange business about human guilt. And if we recognize that we don't have a currency in order to expiate the kinds of relational, existential harm we do to one another, where are we left? Now, again, religions had this. Once the God pronounces pardon, everyone else had better accept the word of the God with respect to the pardon of the person. Because if you don't, now you're against the God. And so this is where in Christianity you have this drama of forgiveness. Now this guilt pride he's talking about, I have seen it working in religious communities, specifically my own conservative Calvinist community, where somehow by virtue of embracing total depravity, I somehow feel that my depravity is expiated by the feeling. Now, again, this isn't irrational because we recognize that money can't do it. Physical things can't do it. It sort of has to be in the upper register. And so if I feel guilty for it, that's a way of expiating the sin. expiating, getting rid of the guilt. And you see this in Wokism, so that if you've got privilege, you need to continue to get in touch with your privilege. You need to do this your whole life long. And if you look at, let's say, the last season of The Bachelor, you saw this on television. It was there played out. You know, did the woman that this man himself picked, he passed over, you know, very attractive, desirable African-American women, and he himself chose this white woman from the South. And then suddenly, because pictures of her participation at an antebellum ball arose, now suddenly, how can this guilt be overcome? Now, in this case, it will be up to him to sort of announce she has paid for her sin of participating in this ball. But now, the court of public opinion, is she going to have to prove it to everyone? So this is, if you can understand these dilemmas, you can see functionally how religions help communities go beyond the moral, basically the moral catastrophes, the moral conflicts that bind them. Again, you can look at René Girard, scapegoats, but you need some way that the community itself will say, the victims will say, I forgive you, and the perpetrators will say, I am forgiven, so we can proceed. And if you don't have an authority like a God that can actually pronounce that, what are you going to do? And so we're sort of stuck with these lesser realms like this guilt pride. I really enjoyed this part of the video.
And we take on basically everlasting responsibility for it. And this is what the Holocaust Memorial at the center of Berlin symbolizes. Yet, at the same time, comes a miraculous transformation. Namely, by admitting the most serious guilt that to such an extent no one has ever yet admitted, by
no one has ever admitted, or they haven't figured out a way to expiate within the iron box of secularism.
Accepting that one is guilty of such an enormous crime that no one ever accepted guilt for, Germany somehow becomes, in a paradoxical way, morally superior again. Because our guilt is greater than everyone else, and our admission of guilt is greater than everyone else's, we become also somehow more morally elevated than anyone else. And we
East Germans, an East German, was her father a pastor? I believe he was.
Can be proud of being capable of accepting such an enormous guilt. So guilt pride is this paradoxical redemption and moral self-elevation through guilt admission. Now,
and again, this is exactly what you see in, as John McWhorter talked about, white people, enormously privileged white people, continuing to express that they have done the work and gotten in touch with their privilege. And so therefore now they are superior to those around them who they consider, because how can you measure any of this? Is it the number of hours? No, it's the depth of the feeling. Okay. Are you going to measure this scientifically? Are you going to maybe put me in a brain scan and the percentage of my body, my mind that lights up in certain areas? Or maybe you're going to take a blood sample because feelings of contrition are associated with certain hormones being released into my body, and you're going to measure that to see who actually is really, really in charge. But again, traditionally in religion, it is the deity who looks, evaluates, judges, can come down to, as we talk about in Christianity, a final judgment. There is no final judgment for any of this. And in fact, if you want to be a smart genocidal society, make sure you wipe out your enemies completely, therefore meaning that the most successful genocidal societies did not have written language and there's no record of the groups that they wiped out. In other words, they got away with it because there's also no God to judge them.
Now let's address the question what wokeism really is. It is neither cultural Marxism, nor is it a postmodernist leftism. At heart, it represents the incorporation of a German-style guilt pride into identity politics that took place after 1989, after the breakdown of communism, after the fall of the Soviet Union, after the end of the Cold War. And thereby, by the way, ironically, despite being against such things as white supremacy, it is actually deeply white, right? It's rooted in Christianity, it's rooted in Western individualism, it's rooted very much in the Western historical experience regarding slavery, colonialism, the Holocaust, and so forth.
Now what's interesting is I don't think he's making an argument that this is a German import, because it clearly isn't. Because again, it very much developed in the United States. And that would make us say something like there's a capacity in humanity that sort of develops within culture where this arises. And in Germany, by virtue of the Holocaust, this guilt pride has arisen, and we'll see to the degree to which wokeism takes hold in Germany, or the way any of this does. I mean, Angela Merkel, the Rest is History podcast talks about this fairly regularly, at some point basically opens the borders out of their, in a sense, their guilt pride and lets all of these Syrians in. And then they have to deal with that.
And that's why, by the way, the Chinese call it Baizuo, white left. So
that's interesting. I hadn't heard this.
From the Chinese perspective, it is clearly seen and identified as a Western and thereby white phenomenon.
And I can imagine that the communist government of China, looking back at, I mean, if you're asking questions about reparations in the United States for slavery, and you look at the numbers killed and persecuted by the Communist Party during the Cultural Revolution, well, they'd better hope that this doesn't develop there, because, wow, it's going to be a big deal if it does. And especially if, again, I don't think he's making the argument that somehow wokeism is a German transplant into the United States, but perhaps this is, in fact, a civil religion that emerges, and I think partly because the tools available in traditional religion are no longer available in the public space. In other words, this redemption for sin. So in a Christian worship service, you can look at my worship service online. A regular part of the worship service is we confess our sins. After we confess our sins, we receive God's forgiveness. And then we go on. And now, of course, someone might say, well, I don't know that you feel bad enough about your sins. I don't know that you know enough about your sins. I would like to tell you more about the way that you have sinned, or your identity group has sinned, or some other group has sinned. And I'm not satisfied enough that you are in any way, whatever means that you might have by which you think I qualify for your forgiveness in order for it to be offered. But again, this is where God figures into the process, because once God has forgiven a sin, well, you can decide, well, I'm not quite sure that they are forgivable because of the magnitude of this sin. then you have to take it up with God. That's how the narrative plays out, and that's how having actually a community that is in relationship with a God who can pardon, finally and fundamentally, is actually a very worthwhile thing for a community here below. And, well, communist China, yeah, if this would take hold there, well, what are you going to do, Communist Party, about the sins of your past?
And it consists basically in some form of taking the moral high ground through intense guilt admission with respect to such things as the Holocaust, or in the American case, slavery.
Now, this guilt admission is also a little bit convenient too, because especially when these heinous acts have happened generations behind us, well, I will accept blame for what, well, none of my biological ancestors held slaves. I know that because my biological ancestors came to the United States in the 1890s. Well, at least my biological ancestors didn't hold African slaves. They might have been slaves. I'm sure some of them were. And I'm sure some of them were slave owners, because pretty much the way it goes with slavery, sex gets involved. And so if you're the descendant of a slave, you're probably also the descendant of a slave owner. And so you've got people on two sides of the register. And this, again, is where we get into these interesting questions of identity. Because for myself, I know that I have Dutch, Frisian, and Jewish ancestry. I haven't taken one of those spit tests yet, but just by virtue of knowing my family tree just a few generations back, these are my genetic material. But is it genetic or is it cultural? So what exactly are the categories through which this guilt and this entire drama with respect to guilt has to be dealt with? Now, what makes this even more fascinating, again, is if we go back to his conversation about morality with Sam Harris, there is seeming to emerge, and I am noticing this more and more, and it's very much in him, and I think we're going to find it in others, both a realization that morality in the secular realm cannot be handled. You cannot find, you basically cannot find it, because if you say, well, this is sort of a language game, it's pretty easy to brush away. And this has been, whereas I think a lot of Christian apologists haven't really been able to make the argument stick very well. This is an anxiety that Christian apologists have, and I think many people have with respect to atheism, that there's a suspicion that somehow if you lose a God, morality starts to get slippery. And to actually talk about it is much more difficult. But I think part of what we see emerging in this, and I think I will want to go back and walk through his video about Sam Harris. Again, I'm really enjoying his videos. They're quite stimulating. His presentation is clear. He's bringing some new perspectives and new ideas that I hadn't thought of, especially in this video. But there's a sense that without the kinds of narrative imagery that traditional religions afford, some of this other upper register commerce, transactions, traffic, we can't really process them productively without people getting trapped as eternal victims or eternal oppressors. And we're seeing that in this wokeism.
There is at the same time a very strong focus on identity, right? Today, identity is very much curated through the curation of profiles. And I talk about length at this in the You and Your Profile book, which just recently came out. So it serves the function of creating an identity, both for individuals as well as for organizations. CIA, for instance, is an organization.
Now, in his German example, this is interesting because, of course, with the division of Germany, because East Germany was communist, it didn't matter if the individuals or their parents had participated in the Wehrmacht or the Nazi Party or the SS. By virtue of taking on the identity of being part of the communist movement, they could be anti-fascist, something that in some ways wasn't available to the West Germans. And this again is where these identity and these profile identities begin to become important to these narratives.
So it is an identity politics that creates identity in the form of profiles. Now, what are profiles? Profiles are publicly projected images that once you get positive feedback on them, you can identify with and you can internalize. And we did some other videos on this as well with regard to the philosophy channel, Philosophy Tube. So this brings us now to an updated and more complex definition of what Wokism is. Wokism is a civil religion combining American individualistic liberalism with guilt pride.
And I think this is actually a very good definition. And it's interesting that, of course, he sources his idea of guilt pride, but he's finding it both in America and in Nazi Germany. Now, I want to bring up an article that I've brought up many times in my channel. This is from the Hedgehog Review, The Strange Persistence of Guilt by Wilfred M. McClay. And it's a piece that I've read at least a couple of times, and it basically goes through the fact that our secular society is now finding guilt an increasing problem. And some of the means available to traditional societies and Christian societies to deal with guilt are, by virtue of its atheism or agnosticism, no longer available.
It is based on and comes from identity politics and focuses on the creation of identity profiles.
And I think that's an excellent addition. Focuses on the curation of identity profiles. Your profile as an oppressor, an eternal oppressor, must be cultivated in order to invoke this guilt pride to feel that, well, now in some ways you are greater than those oppressors who are unwoke.
Is now penetrating all sectors of society in the West: politics, media, advertising, sports, arts, education, military, and so forth. Now, what is religious about Wokism? First, a strong emphasis on guilt and redemption. Similar to Christianity, there's an emphasis on confessing guilt and the hope of redemption through this confession. Secondly, very strong dogmatism. Certain taboos of public speech and thought. Humor, for instance, becomes more and more suspicious. And there are punitive tendencies, as I pointed out with respect to the Derek Chauvin trial. Basically, all these phenomena that we can nowadays call or associate with so-called cancel culture. Thirdly, there is a divisive moralism to it, right? Jesus Christ famously says in the Bible, "Who's not for me is against me." They're somewhat similar to Wokism, right? There is not much room for neutral ground. There is no fence.
Well, there's a quote to just kind of pull out there.
Sitting, right? You're either for it or against it, and that creates a very binary good-bad distinction with not much middle ground between us and them. So it's basically manifesting itself in this increasingly hostile schism between traditional American civil religion, Trumpism, without guilt pride, and Wokism with guilt pride. We see a very strong symbolic...
And that's really clear with Trump, because again, Trump quite famously said he doesn't apologize. He just doesn't apologize. So he just steps out of the guilt pride game completely. And of course, this drives the woke crazy, because you must apologize. Well, tell me why. Sorry for the poverty of your agnosticism or atheism, because you have no God that will finally bring me to justice. Mao got away with it. Hitler got away with it. Stalin got away with it. All these genocidal individuals that have succeeded in complete genocide because they left no historical record for past generations to either point the finger or accept blame, all get away with it. And you got no one at the other end of the human story to say, I was there, I saw, I knew. You will be called to account and there will be justice. That's something that a full-fledged religious narrative affords.
Struggle about this as well. Like there was this conflict about statues and monuments in the US, where the woke people wanted to take down the monuments, and Trump was saying this cannot be done. So the wokists wanted to, admit and ascribe guilt, whereas Trumpism wanted to basically not allow any form of guilt into American civil religion. Then, fourthly, there's a strong ritualistic conformity pressure, and that's what the notion of virtue signaling points to. But that's also what we see. I gave this example at the beginning of the video when it comes to diversity statements when you apply for a job in academia, right? You have to demonstrate that you are willing to conform. So there is some form of systemic hypocrisy here, right? We have all the woke celebrities famously, and also the CIA video, which are basically easily regarded as forced statements, and therefore their credibility is questioned, because they seem just to be a sort of, as I said, ritualistic conformity. Fifth, there is woke washing of capitalism and imperialism, again, very much represented through the CIA ad. And that is
woke washing, that's a pretty clever term.
Very same function that Christianity had in the 19th century, for instance, and earlier during imperialism, right? The ships that brought soldiers and took the wealth of the colonies also brought Bibles with them. Right? And similarly today, CIA doesn't embrace Christianity anymore, but it embraces Wokism. So it serves a moralistic profile curation of a capitalist and still imperialist institutions. And number 5, there's a strong...
I think this is 6.
Personal internalization that becomes possible through Wokism, just like in religions. It enables a certain fundamentalism, it enables zealotry. So, for instance...
Now this is interesting, because why do we want something that enables fundamentalism and zealotry if, in fact, these aren't for us certain delicious aspects of life that we pursue religious systems in order to afford?
One friend once told me, and this was a remarkable statement, he said that one of his family members had become a reborn Christian, and this somehow destroyed the family because the person developed such a strong zealotry. And in a similar way, I think we see this phenomenon that Wokism also, of course not in everyone, but in some, breeds fundamentalism, breeds zealotry, and leads to what we could probably call a personal over-internalization.
And of course, there are people who get so woke they won't have anything to do with their parents because their parents haven't gotten in touch with their privilege or what have you.
And then 6, of course, it helps the creation of a public identity. some form of civil religious affiliation becomes possible.
And this is, I think, a great point, because recently there have been articles that the Chinese Communist Party is in some ways trying to create a new Confucian religion as sorts to bolster the party. Putin's embrace of the Orthodox Church in Russia, for example. And I think every nation, every successful nation has a religious aspect to it, because it's what you need in order to actually keep the whole thing together. And that's why religion is inevitable.
That's, on the one hand, similar to traditional religions, where you could also define your identity through publicly adopting a faith or publicly professing a faith. However, this now happens, of course, in a very different environment, and as I like to say, it happens on the basis of prophilicity, profile-based identity. So instead of having monks and nuns who, create an identity by going to a monastery and reading texts from the Bible, now you demonstrate your affiliation with wokeness, for instance, by being a YouTuber and by producing social media communication. Now, still we may ask, isn't wokeism about all the right things? Isn't it all great? I mean, and people like Bella and Rousseau also thought that civil religion is basically a very good thing if it's done right. So we could say, yeah, wokeism is perfect. It creates public enthusiasm for justice, equality, human rights. But well, I mean, Christianity also could be considered as having been all great. After all, it created enthusiasm for love and peace. However, with Christianity in hindsight, we also know that it created a lot of problems. Wars, even genocide, fundamentalism, and so forth.
Now, I found this part a little bit interesting because, of course, love and peace, but if you love your country, you fight for it. And if you love, let's say, if you love the Jews who are under the thumb of Nazi Germany, you engaged in war in order to free the Jews from their oppressors. What's interesting is that he sort of goes into the idea that if we abstract out certain values that can sort of be embraced broadly if we don't look too carefully into them, like love and peace, goodness, righteousness. If we sort of abstract these things out, then we can sort of build morality around these ideas. But in almost every war, often nations go into war for the good. Just read the history of the First World War. Many of those nations, well, this is simply what we have to do for the good. Look at the war on terror. People look at religion. Well, if you have peace, we have to engage in war to protect the peace. How many times has that been used? And again, if you go back into his sort of Kantian ethics where, well, it's always wrong to have war. Well, I guess then you're a pacifist. Where's this going to go?
I think it's important to see that just as Christianity did not invent love and peace, Wokism also did not invent justice and equality. I think it can be said that Christianity somehow appropriated and to a certain extent even monopolized love and peace, and thereby imposed a sort of dogmatic belief system onto it, which led not only but also to war and fanaticism. And these problems with Christianity have been pointed out by many people, just to mention a few, Nietzsche in the 19th century and very recently Sam Harris. And to point out these problems, of course, of Christianity, for instance, is not to argue against love and peace, but against what could be called the corruption of love and peace through some form of religious appropriation. And similarly, I guess, to point out...
As if love and peace are just kind of out there and, well, where are they? What are they?
The problems with Wokism as a civil religion is, of course, not to argue against justice and equality, but against their civil religious appropriation, and even monopolization. So to conclude, I think maybe in these times of a new awakening in form of Wokism, we might again be in need of a second enlightenment, as I pointed out in an earlier video, right? And we might remember Kant's critique of philosophy as the maidservant of theology,
which is to be the light bearer ahead, which is very interesting. And here again, I think we get into the sense of what he's looking for from philosophy.
And ask of philosophy that it doesn't become the maidservant of Wokism. Its job is not to abolish Wokism, but to critically shed light on it, to question it, so that it does not turn into a fundamentalist frenzy.
So that's the Wokism video. And again, I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot from it, made a lot of good points. There's some of my critique of it and some of my thoughts. I hope this was profitable for you. Leave a comment.